What's up, everybody? It's John here from Black and Gold Weekly, and we are ready to go for episode 4 here of the show. And this week we have a very, very special guest, Shannon from the Slapshot Sweethearts podcast, a fantastic podcast that if you guys haven't heard of that yet, definitely get out there, follow on Twitter, great Twitter follow, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts, make sure you check out Slapshot Sweethearts. It's a fantastic show. I listen every week, and it's really become one of my favorite hockey podcasts out there. So, Shannon, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know you're a relatively new podcast as well, so we love getting to know each other, getting to know the rest of hockey Twitter and the hockey podcast scene. So, and as a fellow Bruins fan, it's always nice to get to know Black and Gold fans as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the Bruins, their season now fully underway. They've played a few games. They've got a big week coming up this week with the Flyers and the Penguins. Always tough matchups there. We're going to get a lot into Boston and how they've looked so far and where they might be headed this season. But before that, I just need to point out there's 3 links down in the description. All your hockey gear needs right there, whether it's Boston Bruins, that's the first link. Any other NHL team, any NHL team you want, that's the second link. And the third link, NCAA, college, whatever college you want to rep, whether it's hockey or whatever else, all the college gear down in there as well. So check out the description and check out those links. And Shannon, I don't know about you, but it's been what you think, but it's been an interesting start to the Bruins season this year. They're 1-1-1 after their first 3 games. And just what are your general thoughts on how the team has looked so far?
Yeah, so, I'm a little surprised. I guess I had my hopes up after, the President's Trophy winning team. I was, ready for them to just come in and tear it up, even though they are in the most difficult division in the NHL. But they haven't looked as great as I hoped. I think they have had, some easier games that they probably should have been winning. There's probably some rust to knock off as well, but I am a little worried going into the next week. Like you said, the Flyers and the Penguins haven't looked that great either, but the Flyers have looked great. Barring one bad loss from Buffalo, they have looked very consistent and not like the bubble was a fluke, like a lot of people said for Philadelphia. So
yeah, it's opening up with New Jersey, I think, had a lot of people thinking, all right, that's a nice kind of almost easy way to start the season. And then New Jersey came out flying, and Boston was able to win that first game in the shootout, but then they dropped the second one, and then they got a very tough defensive matchup against the Islanders. And all of a sudden, Bruins fans are like, well, hang on, there's some real competition here. And New Jersey's looked actually a lot better than I think most people thought going in. But I think the biggest thing that Bruins fans are talking about now are the lack of goal scoring. And Boston is the only team in the league that doesn't have a 5-on-5 goal that's actually played a game. Dallas is the only other team, and they haven't played yet. So the lack of scoring certainly seems to be a worrisome issue here for most Bruins fans. What do you think that's something that we should be worried about long term, or is it just a slow start to the season that they're going to turn around?
I think you were definitely right about the Devils. I chose them in our Slapshot Sweethearts episode as my dark horse, actually, but I chose them prior to Corey Crawford retiring because they had that dual threat goalie situation. And Mackenzie Blackwood showed us in our games that he is not fooling around and he is going to be a threat in the East. And I think it is a healthy mix of we have faced some tough goaltenders in our first 3 games, but also we are not taking competitive shots, and it is really showing. We thought that our biggest weakness was going to be on the defense because we lost Chara and Krug, but we're not shooting enough to, make an impact. I know we were taking a lot of shots with the Islanders, but not ones that were really going to be goals. Yes. And I think, obviously, Pastrnak is not in right now, so that is something that, is a mitigating factor, something that you can consider, once he is back, even though I believe he's out for 2 months. So that's something like we're going to have to work around at some point. And I hope that Marchand and Bergeron and DeBrusque and all those guys can really, kick it up a notch. I know Marchand was pretty much running that first game. He won a shootout game, which is rare for the Bruins to begin with.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think something to, mitigate the risk is that they're missing Pastrnak, but it's a short season. They've got to learn to work without him.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up David Pastrnak, which was going to be the next thing I thought of. I think that we're seeing the importance of David Pastrnak to this lineup, and now that they don't have him, hopefully he'll be back in February. That seems to be the timeline now. Is that he'll be back in February. He has been practicing the last few days with a non-contact jersey. So they're still going to have to go at least another few weeks here without David Pastrnak. And I think, he's a guy that is probably the best pure goal scorer on the team, and a guy that is responsible for so much offense on that top line with Bergeron and Marchand. I think we're really seeing the importance of David Pastrnak to this lineup and how much the Bruins need him to be healthy for them to have that high-end offense that they want to have going.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up, the high end offense versus just consistency, because we had Dale Arnold from Nesson and WEEI on for our second episode, and something that he brought up, because it was right in the interim between them naming Bergeron as the captain, was where is that young leadership really going to protrude? And as they were starting training camp, he was really high on, and is still high, I'm assuming, on Charlie McAvoy kind of stepping up and leading those younger guys. But I think with Pasternak's absence, he might not be, the next captain, but it's showing that Pastrnak does have a huge impact in the energy level and the consistency and the impact on the offensive side of the roster, at least. And especially, that top line is the best in the NHL when all three of them are there. But there are three other lines that really need to step it up as well. And I think Pasternak's energy on the ice and on the bench is really important to all of the offense, taking those shots that are actually going to go in the net and just not flinging it over there. We're taking a ton of shots, but are they actually going to go in the net unless the goalie screws up? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And Pasternak's a guy that he has that ability to really snipe one. And he has that offensive goal scoring just touch around the net. And there's not that many guys in this lineup without him that really have that. The Bruins are more of kind of a grind it out, score on the rebounds, go to the net kind of team, but they don't have those, with the exception of Pastrnak, Bergeron, and Marchand on that top line. They really don't have those superstar players that you see. There's no real Austin Matthews in this lineup without a David Pastrnak, who I think can, will probably be competing with Matthews for a lot of goal scoring titles over the next number of years. But they don't have that high-end, superstar level offense. So they got to kind of grind out goals. And then when you take the best goal scorer out of the lineup, it puts all the more pressure on some of these lower lines to really get themselves going. And they haven't at all so far this season, which is one thing I've been really disappointed with. I thought with Craig Smith coming in, with, getting Ritchie and Kasha, now Kasha's hurt already, but, he was healthy to start the season. I thought getting them after, they came in at the deadline but didn't really have a chance to get situated last year. Now they had a training camp and they had some time to, find their spot in this lineup. DeBrusk, I thought, was going to have a big year this year after signing that contract, and he's done nothing so far. I've been really disappointed with the secondary scoring of this team, because I thought they would be good enough offensively to kind of mitigate that loss of Pastrnak.
Yeah, and I think you made a really great point that although David Pastrnak is the one that's taking all those shots, we really do rely on those, messy goals, the shorthanded goal, it tips in, it gets knocked in, unless you have someone like Pastrnak out there making the plays. Krejci does make a lot of those plays, but it takes that second line, group of guys to make the plays with him. He can't do it all alone. And it's showing with Marchand that Pasternak's not out there. Last season, the two of them were going hand in hand and in tandem up the rankings for assists, up the rankings for points, up the rankings for goals. And without Pastrnak out there making those plays with Marchand, obviously Marchand does not need Pastrnak to make all of those plays, but it's making an impact that he is not up there with McDavid like he was last season, just because the two of them they have chemistry together, they have that energy to work together. And I think it's really showing right now that it's not a one-man show in Boston. They really need Pastrnak, they really need Marchand. They need them all to work together. So
yeah, absolutely. And, hopefully we can get Pastrnak back soon, because I think that is going to be a huge boost to the Bruins, and we're going to start to see them play better when he does get back into the lineup. But and even when he does come back, I still see a lot of the same things that I issues offensively with the Bruins, and that's how heavily they rely on that top line. And when you look around the league, obviously there are some great lines around the league. You've got the McKinnon line in Colorado. You've got the top line in Toronto with Matthews and Marner and whoever they decide to put on the wing with those two. You've got Calgary's top line that's always, had a down year last year, but can explode at any point with Lindholm, Monahan, and Gaudreau. There are great lines around the league, but what we see, I think, from the best teams in the league is that they have depth scoring, and they have 2 and 3 lines that can score. And one of the issues, I think, for the Bruins have been they've been so reliant on that Bergeron, Marchand, Pastrnak line, they don't get enough from the second and third lines. And, I mean, Krejci's a great offensive player, but he has a revolving door of wings around him. They haven't been able to consistently find anyone to play on the right side. And, that doesn't allow that chemistry to form. DeBrusk had a down year last year and hasn't been good to start this year. It's the same story. It's the same story. It's the Bruins are this top line, and then everyone below them kind of disappoints offensively. And even if when Pastrnak does come back, the Bruins get into the playoffs, you're looking at another series like they had against the Lightning last year, where the offense fails out at the end and they just can't go super deep into the playoffs because they don't have that scoring depth.
Yeah, I think that's really important. If you look at how their training camp roster evolved, I couldn't confidently say who they were going to keep and who they weren't, just because, like you said, it's a literal revolving door on their offense on, is this guy actually going to make an impact this year? Oh, maybe. Let's try this guy. Let's try this guy. And it's very frustrating as a fan seeing how they are just trying, going back and forth. And a few years ago, everyone said that the Bruins had such a deep prospect pool. It was going to be so successful. Now, a lot of those prospects have kind of flared out, and it's just looking at, can this guy score maybe 10 goals? Maybe 10. And I think losing Chara and Krug is actually showing to be really significant to the goal scoring side of the game as well, because the defense isn't making a lot of offensive plays anymore either. Krug was leading in the penalty kill, both on the shorthanded side and in stopping goals. Chara had that slap shot that we're really missing right now. And, the defense is pretty much holding their own, but they're not making any sort of impact on the offensive side of the play either. And, because we're lacking with the loss of Pastrnak for at least until February, and, the prospects aren't really stepping up in the lower lines, it's really showing those minor losses even on the defensive end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when Krug left, we knew that there was going to be an impact on the offense, and we knew that was going to take away, your top offensive defenseman. Losing that out of the lineup is not easy for any team. But, we haven't really seen the younger guys. I mean, they've played well defensively. The young defense has really held their own in keeping the puck out of their own net, and I think that's been a bright spot for Boston so far this year. But you're right, they haven't really been able to contribute offensively and really drive the play the way that a guy like Torrey Krug could, either with his stretch passes or with his skating ability. And, Grzelcyk was the guy that was supposed to kind of step into that role, and we saw him get injured in the New York game late in the third period against the Islanders, and that would be a huge blow if he has to miss any sort of significant time, or even if he's even playing but not at 100%. You're already losing more offense from the back end there. I am a little concerned about this team offensively, because I think a lot of the same problems with their offense that we've seen over the past couple of years are still there, and I don't think there's really an easy or quick fix for it.
No, and I think something that I was frustrated with looking at the offseason and looking at, free agency and the trade deadline and all of that is that the Bruins have not been quick to make a major move as of late in the last few years. And I understand that they were the President's Trophy winner. They are an elite team. But as you said, they're missing a major piece. They don't have that depth that they need to go and make a long run. They don't compare to Tampa's roster in terms of, consistency in those lower lines and things like that. And it's going to show when we get, even though it's a shortened season, Well, because it's a shortened season, it's going to show, because if they keep taking bad losses, to the Devils and to those types of teams,
Yep.
it's going to show later when we try to get into a playoff spot and we have a bad seed and we have to, play those teams earlier. I mean, in a shortened season, it's both good and bad, because maybe we're, not as injured by the end, but we're also taking more losses earlier. I mean, it's frustrating as a fan looking at them at the trade deadline, at free agency, and not seeing an aggressiveness that I want to see, like a Danny Ainge aggressiveness, as the Celtics typically do, and trying to pursue anybody available to make your team better, versus just sitting back and trusting that those young guys at some point will be good when years are going by and they're not making significant strides.
Yeah, and I think the Bruins have kind of taken this approach where they want to keep this core intact, and then they have these young guys coming up, and they don't ever want to go through a full rebuild. They're trying to retool a little bit on the fly, and they seem skittish. They seem scared to go out and make a big move. And I just think that other teams around the league are getting better, and other teams around the league are consistently improving their roster. And Boston's kind of, they're like, no, we're going to give, DeBrusk another year. DeBrusk is a guy I think you could have traded and gotten a decent haul back in return for. And they seem to, no, we're going to give DeBrusk another year. He's still young. We want to see what he can do. Well, he started this year, and I don't even think he has a point yet. I mean, it hasn't been a good start for DeBrusk, and they went out, they got Kasha, and again, that's one of those like second tier, middle of your lineup type moves. Rather than going out and trying to make a big splash and bring in a high end player, they go out and they get guys like Kasha and Richie, and they make these second tier moves without ever making that big splash move.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were so many guys that could have replaced Krug when they didn't re-sign Krug, which I literally remember exactly where I was when I got the notification that they couldn't keep him, which was incredibly frustrating. Yep. But there are so many guys that could have replaced him. There were so many offensive defensemen that were available in free agency, and they couldn't land one. I think the last time they really landed someone that has made an impact on the roster was Charlie Coyle, and it was a trade deadline trade, and we didn't expect him to be that good. We only got him to get us over the hump into the playoffs, and then he ended up making a way larger impact than he did in Minnesota, which, I mean, good for Bruce Cassidy for doing that, but it still, when they made the move, wasn't a flashy or an elite move or anything of that sort. It was one of those smaller, mid-range, fine. Bruins fans were like, whatever.
Yeah, it was a third line move at the time. And I mean, Coyle now is still your third line center, but that I think has honestly been Don Sweeney's best move as GM. That Coyle trade looks like an absolute, home run right now, with the way that he's played in a Bruins uniform. But those moves that work out that well are kind of few and far between here in the Don Sweeney era, where they really do. They seem unable to pull off that big move that's going to take them to that next step and really put them into cup contender, or not even not contender, but cup favorite status, where I think they've been a contender, but they've been a little bit short. And then, we've seen them 2 out of the last 3 playoffs. They've lost to Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay's an absolutely loaded roster. And we did see them go to the finals in 2019, but then they couldn't pull it out at the end. And it feels like there's that one thing missing with this team, and they just haven't been able to find that piece that is going to get them over that hump.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one interesting point is that they're not necessarily a destination for free agents right now because they're not making themselves attractive. During the big Tavares free agency race, the Bruins were not advertising themselves as somewhere like, oh, come here and we're going to win a cup. Like the Maple Leafs did it. Tampa did it. All of these teams that are competitive and typically are in our division were out there trying to get in there, trying to show everything they had to offer in the next decade. And the Bruins were like, come join us if you want. We're pretty good. It's about it. And Tavares isn't even the only example, but anytime there's someone that really could make an impact and is pretty much has all the cards out on the floor, what they want out of a team, the Bruins never go out there and say here's what we can give you. Come join us. Come join what we're trying to work toward, because they don't sell it. They're not sellers, which is frustrating as a team who could be really great if they just tried to market themselves better.
Yeah, it seems like they're almost just content with where they're at. And then they're hoping that some of these younger guys are going to blossom into these star players. And McAvoy, I think, is the one that has, top level defenseman written all over him. And he's still young and still developing, but he's shown a lot of signs that he could be, maybe even a Norris Trophy winner at some point in his career. But the other young guys, I mean, they just haven't turned into what the Bruins thought. Anders Bjork had a lot of injuries early in his career. I remember when he came out of Notre Dame, he was supposed to be a like 25, 30 goal guy coming out
Yeah.
of college. And
He was supposed to be Pastrnak. It wasn't
yeah,
supposed to be this way.
yeah, Anders Bjork had a lot of hype around him when he came out of college, and he had a lot of injuries in his first couple years, and that I think really set him back as far as his development goes. And he hasn't really shown any signs of consistent goal scoring. And Jake DeBrusk he had that one good year, and then since then it's kind of been downhill from him. And then the other guys that they got in that 2015 draft, Zach Senyshyn can't even crack an NHL lineup, and
I was gonna say, I think they cut him this year, didn't they?
yeah, they said he's down. He'll be back in Providence probably when they start. But he's never turned into anything. He hasn't even been good down in Providence, never mind up in the NHL. And Jakub Zboril was the guy that they took first in that 2015 draft, and he's just cracking the NHL lineup now as a third pair defenseman. So these young guys haven't turned into the star players that the Bruins thought they were going to when they drafted them and brought them in.
And I think one key point from what you said there is that Charlie McAvoy is still developing, and even though he is taking on the leadership role with Kevin Miller, which is interesting because I don't know that Kevin Miller can fill that leadership role the same way that the Bruins want him to. But in regards to Charlie McAvoy, he is taking on that leadership role. He is the most developed of those young guys on the blue line right now.
Mm-hmm.
But he worked paired with Chara for years, and they just let Chara go. And I mean, Chara is an irreplaceable leader. He's an irreplaceable defenseman. Obviously, he gave so much to the Bruins for decades. But I live in Washington, D.C. now. So looking at him play with the Capitals is incredibly frustrating because he is giving everything to the Bruins that he was giving last year, and the Bruins wanted to give him minimal minutes. And it's incredible. It's super frustrating seeing how it's playing out with the Capitals and now how the Bruins blue line is lacking that development. And even all the young guys are lacking that development. And I don't think it's necessarily a knock on Bergeron because he's an incredible leader. But, they're kind of flailing right now in terms of like where those young guys are going to fit, which one's going to step up, how they're going to fill that gap. And I think that's kind of a growing pain. But, seeing that Chara didn't retire and there's still that hole there, especially for McAvoy, who, isn't done growing, is interesting.
Yeah, and the more I look at the loss of Chara, the more I think I started to realize just how big of an impact that's had, and what the impact that Chara had. Even though, I was very critical of him in the playoffs last year. He did not play well. He got skated around quite a bit, and I wasn't opposed to them letting him go at first, but now seeing that gap, especially in the leadership department, and just they could have easily just brought him back and given him the opportunity to earn his minutes and say, you know what, we need you there to kind of mentor these young guys for one more year. And I think, you're certainly seeing that gap. And now there's a lot of pressure on young guys. And we see Zboril up in the lineup now. We've seen Jeremy Lauzon have to move up to the top pair. And that's been an adjustment for him, although I think in the Islanders game, Lauzon had the best game I've seen him play at the NHL level. He was very good in that game. But the opening couple of games against New Jersey, Lauzon looked a little bit out of place up there playing with McAvoy. There's so much pressure on these young guys now to where some of them may not be ready for that yet. And the Bruins have put themselves in a situation where they're just kind of throwing them out there and saying, whether you're ready or not, you've got to go out and do this.
Yeah, and I think one major thing that we're seeing, especially because it's the shortened season and the health and safety protocols with COVID-19, is that if they lose anybody to health and safety protocols or quarantine or anything like that, they don't have the depth to fill those holes anymore. They don't have, all their prospects are already out on the ice. So if they lose anybody, they're a little bit screwed. They don't have any, like their taxi squad and their depth in Providence is not built to fill those holes. They're already skating on thin ice. And I think, especially, getting later in the season when they do try to, fill that playoff spot and try to go, as far as they're going to go, they're not set for success in terms of depth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you start having to pull guys up from Providence or even from the taxi squad, you're in trouble at that point if you're the Bruins, because they don't have the depth that some other teams have, especially on the back end where they can just plug guys in. Now, they do have John Moore and Connor Clifton kind of just sitting there waiting for a chance, but I don't know how much you're going to get out of John Moore at this point. Clifton's wild to watch. He's really fun to watch. He brings a lot of physicality and a lot of spark for such a small player, but at the same time, he gets caught out of position a lot, and you see him almost playing right wing some nights rather than right defense, where he gets up into the play just too much. And he's kind of a wild card back there where he's just all over the ice and just playing that wild, crazy style of hockey that he does play, but at some points that can be a detriment as well. So I'm not overly surprised that he's kind of not been there to start the season. They seem to be taking this approach where they're going to focus on defense first, especially with the young defensemen, and get them playing well in their own end and then worry about the offense later. They've played well defensively. I will say that's been a big bright spot to start this season, and I don't want this whole show to be just negative about Boston. They've been really good defensively to start the season, and I think that was one of the biggest questions. Was Zaboral, I think, has been solid, particularly in his own zone. Lauzon had a tough start, but he seems to be coming around and getting ready to where he's more comfortable in that top role that he's in. Carlo and Grzelcyk, actually, I've been a little bit disappointed with because they just haven't had the impact that I thought that they would, particularly with how good Carlo has been, last year, and he had a phenomenal defensive season. But again, he lost his D partner. He lost Krug, and I think that really kind of shook things up a little bit and affected him. But overall, they haven't given up a lot of goals. They're playing very well defensively, and I think that's something that Bruins fans should be really happy about, especially with a young defense where a lot of times young defenses kind of go the other way and struggle in their own end.
Yeah, I was going to say they're not giving up a lot of goals, and I think that's something that you often miss when the record isn't that great. Mm-hmm. They're not, Halak and Rask are both playing well. The defense is playing incredibly well, especially because they're all so young and we did lose two key defensive pieces. It is the fact that we're not taking the right shots and we're not taking enough of them that is really making an impact in these games. And I think it's really interesting that Cassidy is taking the approach of, solidifying the defense before the offense. And I kind of understand the approach just because, when Pastrnak does come back, he's hoping that the spark will return, I'm assuming.
Yep.
And because Bergeron has taken over the captainship role and he is on the offense, you'd think that leadership shifting a bit would help the offense. I mean, thinking that their offense hasn't really changed that much in terms of roster besides adding Craig Smith and, Richie and all of that, you'd hope that would be a boost. I think maybe part of it is just a chemistry thing right now. They need to, kick it up a notch and try to figure out what works best. I hope that Cassie doesn't start tinkering with the lines like he often likes to do.
He does.
It's like a little puzzle for him. I mean, I'm hoping he doesn't do that, but we'll see. I mean, like I said, a shortened season, he might have to. We'll see if something works more. As long as he doesn't mess with the first line, I'm okay.
Yep. Yeah, he's already, with Pastrnak out, we saw Studnicka start the year up on that right side. Then he's put DeBrusk up there. He's tried, I believe, Bjork up there a couple of times. He's already shuffled some of these lines around, and if it is a chemistry issue, then that's something that you've got to kind of work out over time, and just these guys have to play together. And if you start messing with the line combinations this early in the season, then they're never going to work those chemistry issues out because guys are going to have different line mates every game, and it's going to be playing with new guys all the time. And so Cassidy does love to line juggle. He when it comes to coaches in the NHL, I think he is one of the most active line jugglers around the league, where he'll give it one game, and if it's not good, he's switching it up already. And it's kind of the exact opposite of what we see in like Edmonton with Dave Tippett, who he's got to lose 5 games in a row before he'll change his lines, and that style has its own detriment because you can go on long losing streaks with a lineup that isn't working. But Cassidy is so quick to just shuffle guys around, And it might have that definitely could have an effect on the inability to gain chemistry with your line mates, because you have new line mates, every 2 games you're playing with someone else, and you can never really get acquainted with who you have, out there with you.
Yeah, and I think, when Pastrnak does come back, he's obviously going to go up on that first line with
Yep.
Bergeron and Marchand. So it's kind of difficult for those guys on the second through fourth line that are probably going to play with those same guys. They're not going to be up on the first line. They're not going to be, on the second line filling in those holes. If he doesn't solidify the chemistry on the second through fourth line now, we're going to be, a month behind when Pastrnak gets back and he actually solidifies what he wants to see as long-term lines. And obviously with injuries and things like that, you do have to shuffle them around a little bit. But, trying to make sure that when the lines do shift now, he keeps them relatively stable. And I think one other thing to note is that the Bruins, I mean, they're humble guys, but they probably weren't expecting to be given such a run for their money against the Devils. And I think that probably messed with their head a little bit. And now they're not in a funk. It's only 3 games, but they have to kind of re-solidify themselves the same way that they did at the beginning of the bubble. They were the President's Trophy winners, and they went in and they were confident, and then they ended up with the bottom seed in the round robin because they just looked awful, weren't playing well together, weren't confident, just not putting in the effort. And I think it's a little bit of the same thing right now, where they were just expecting to go in, win their first 2 games, confident their offense didn't really change. They could just start, rifling shots and they would be fine. But it obviously didn't work out that way, and now they're going into a tougher point in their schedule, and they don't necessarily have it all together. So it's kind of it's a mental game as much as it is the tinkering of the lines and the defense solidifying themselves, all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think another bright spot that we've seen so far has been the fourth line, which has been consistent. Cassidy has not messed with that fourth line because they've honestly probably been the Bruins' best line to start the season. And
Yeah.
they haven't done anything really offensively, but they're a fourth line. You're only going to get limited offense from them. But man, have they been effective in the way that they've played. Trent Frederic, Sean Corrali, and Chris Wagner. I think Frederic is certainly not going to be coming out of the lineup anytime soon. He's earning his spot. They've been physical. They've gotten under the opponent's skin. They've been very difficult to play against. They've been responsible defensively. Everything that you want a fourth line to be. I'd love to see them chip in a goal or 2 here over the course of this next week, but the fourth line's been really good, and Frederic in particular is really kind of establishing himself as an NHL player, and almost in kind of a pest role where we saw him really get under the skin of PK Subban in those 2 games against New Jersey. And then he gave Matt Barzal a little shot after the whistle in the first period in the Islanders game, and then Matt Martin had to come over and say something to him about that. Obviously, the Islanders aren't going to let you mess around with Barzal, but Frederic and that fourth line as a whole, I've been really happy with, and they're playing that physical, annoying fourth line style of hockey that you want to see them play.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I love Chris Wagner. This is what, his 3rd season with the Bruins, 2nd or 3rd.
Yes.
And he's from Boston. He's from right where I grew up. And so it was really awesome to see him come back to the Bruins. And he has solidified himself as a really great asset to the Bruins lower lines, especially as an older guy in the NHL with the experience. And he's really helped Sean Corrali grow. And then bringing Frederic onto that fourth line, as Marchand has really grown out of that pest role and more into a leader and a consistent left winger, Frederic has, like you said, come into that pest role just the way the Bruins needed him to, and is really, instead of, showing teams that the Bruins are, that President's Trophy team that they used to be and that skill player. I know a lot of people talk about that, in the Milan Lucic era and Adam McQuaid and Sean Thornton, when we were, the bullies that just were hitting everyone and all of that. We kind of moved away from that and we didn't have that scare anymore or that annoyance. So I think, making sure that we have those pests on the roster still and those people that can fight, not that Trent Frederic is necessarily fighting, but he is getting under people's skin and making sure that we are, distracting people in the same way that we used to. And I think Marchand was doing a good job of it in a different way. And Frederic is making sure that in some manner, especially now that we don't have Chara, we are, still messing with our opponents' heads and things like that. And it's really nice to see, just as a general hockey fan, not even as a Bruins fan.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I hope that line continues to play the way that they have, because they're going to be right up there with top fourth lines in the league if they do. I know Tampa has a pretty good fourth line. The Islanders, we just played them. That fourth line of Matt Martin, Casey Cizikas, and Cal Clutterbuck. That's kind of been the poster child of great fourth lines in the NHL over the past few years. Just the way that they play, and they had a huge postseason last year, helping the Islanders get to the conference finals. And if Boston can get fourth line production like those teams get, then that's going to really help them down the road and really help them in playoff hockey when the physicality does ramp up.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen Frederick fight yet this season. He's fought quite a bit down in Providence. He's certainly capable with the gloves off. Kevin Miller's another guy that physically is going to have to take on that kind of, not really an enforcer. There's no true enforcers anymore, but he's going to have to be the guy that steps up and stands up for his teammates. And we saw that happen against Miles Wood in the second New Jersey game. Just like 10 seconds into the game, he and Wood were going at it because Miles Wood ran Tuukka Rask a couple of times in the first game. So Miller, I think, is almost taking that Chara role over as being the protector of guys in Boston. And I'd like to see Frederick get in on that. I'd like to see Nick Ritchie get in on that. I think you're going to need more than one guy that can do that. But having Miller back, I think, is big for this Bruins team. Him being a veteran guy and him being a very tough player and a physical guy on that back end to kind of help mitigate the loss of Chara's physicality a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad that obviously I'm glad that he was able to get over 2 years of injury and come back. That's so impressive to begin with. Yeah. But I'm really glad that him going through all of those injuries didn't affect his aggressiveness or his ability or his mental ability to go into those fights or anything like that. As someone who goes through injuries like that, you'd obviously think as just a human being, they would be a little bit adverse or skittish to go into those types of situations where they are literally putting themselves in harm's way. But it's really nice to see, especially as we've lost Chara, that he's going in and protecting his teammates, especially in those situations where Rask is put at risk or, those younger guys are put at risk. I know that running into goalies this season has actually been very common, and it's something that the NHL is kind of looking at, especially after that first game against New Jersey when Rask was really getting hit. And I think that it's really reassuring seeing that the Bruins haven't lost that protection role and that they aren't going to get walked all over in that realm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing goalies get kind of shoved around a little bit more is because there are teams around the league who aren't really doing anything about it. And just last night, Evander Kane speared Jordan Binnington right in the groin. And you would think that someone on the Blues would do something about that, but they really didn't. And if you're an offensive player, especially if you're a power forward type player like Miles Wood, or Chris Kreider, or a Wayne Simmons, players like that who they have to go to the net to score goals. That's what they do. They are drive the net, score on rebounds, get chances off the rush, just going to the net. They have to go to the net to be able to score goals. And if the opposing team's defense isn't going to do anything to keep them away from the net, they're just going to keep getting closer and closer and closer to that goalie until, someone stops them. So it's good to see, Miles Wood kind of get the message there from Boston, like, hey, you're not going to be running into Tuukka Rask, or we're going to have something to say about it. And I think, we've seen a lot of goalies kind of put in peril because there aren't enough defenses around the league keeping those guys away from the goaltender, and they're going to take every inch that they can get. So it's going to be important to make sure that you stick up for your goaltenders, not just for the Bruins, but for all NHL teams. You gotta send that message early that you're not going to touch our goalie.
Yeah, it was something Carter Hutton last night got rammed through one of the Flyers defensemen as well, which is why I thought of it. Our episode on Slapshot Sweethearts this week is all about goalies, and one of the biggest shticks that my co-host Megan noticed was that so many goalies right now in the NHL are young. They're at least half of them are under 25. And I think that really says a lot about why not even just, those young blue line players or those young lower line forwards need support in terms of leadership. But, imagine if our goaltender was 23 through 25, they would need Kevin Miller to get out there. And if a 23-year-old was getting rammed and it wasn't Rask, who, is just going to brush it off and be like, screw you.
Yep.
They would need Kevin Miller to get up there and say, get off my goalie, because there's not as much that, Mackenzie Blackwood, who's only 24, can do about it. Not that he can't hold his own, but, it's a mental thing where, it's this young goalie. He hasn't really proved himself as much. And, we don't see goalie fights as often
Yeah.
as we do see, Trent Frederick and Providence drop the gloves, Chara drop the gloves, all that.
Yeah, and if you look at the goaltenders that are more feisty and are a little bit more physical, it's usually the older guys. It's because they were coming up into the league in an era where it was more physical than it is now, and
Yeah.
this probably isn't the first time they've been hit. So you see them get a little more feisty about it. Robin Leonard does it. Carey Price even has shown that, you don't want to run into him. Darcy Kemper, he went at it with the almost entire Calgary Flames team last year after Matthew Tkachuk had a little incident in front of his net. We did see one goalie fight last year, and it was Mike Smith, who's like 40 years old, and it was Cam Talbot, and Talbot's been around the block. So it is kind of the older goaltenders are a little bit more feisty. They're a little bit more used to contact because the game was more physical when they were, coming up through the junior ranks and into the NHL. And these young goalies, some of them have probably never really had to deal with that before. And if you're a offensive player that plays a physical game in front of the net, you're trying to feast all over that. So it makes it even more important to have a defense there that's going to protect these young goaltenders and make sure that these guys aren't taking advantage of them, because there's a lot of really great young goaltending in the league right now.
Yeah.
I don't think we've ever seen goaltenders this young be this good at such a young age before in the NHL, and there's gonna be kind of an awakening for some of them as they get to the physicality of the NHL and realize that, hey, there's gonna be guys in your crease, there's gonna be guys slashing at your glove after the whistle, and you got to protect yourself, and you really need your defense to protect you.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the episode, that the Bruins' primary shot game right now is coming off of bounces and coming off of whatever's happening in the crease. And if they can chip something in, I'm sure the Bruins are not the only team that's really relying on that type of game right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you are that 23-year-old that's a net and is not used to people playing as aggressively as, say, a Bruins team does in the crease, you're probably going to get beat up a little bit. And if you're mentally not there, they're wearing pads and stuff, it's probably not painful. But if it's not a mental game where you're getting poked and prodded at and you're like where the heck's the puck, it's going to be something that they're going to have to adjust to, and then hope that the guys on the ice on their team are at least saying, get out of the crease, get away from my goaltender, like, let's play a fair game.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So I had a question here, switching back to focusing on the Bruins and the start that they've had. Who's been your most who have you been most pleasantly surprised by this season for Boston?
Pleasantly surprised by, I mean, I think Frederick was a good pick. I think, Marchand's not necessarily a pleasant surprise, but he did the interview during training camp saying that he was really happy about his offseason surgery and that he was playing at 80% prior. And I was really excited to see in the first game coming right out the gate that he had the shootout goal and the regular play goal. Yep. And I think that that's something that really exhilarated me as a fan, that, he was going to come right out and continue his play. When we were doing our interview with Dale Arnold, one of my questions to him was, as someone who speaks to Brad Marchand in the locker room pretty regularly and, watches all their games, does the analysis, do you think that, he's just like blowing smoke? Do you think he really can go up another 20% in caliber? And Dale was like, yeah, I really do. I think that he's one of the best left wingers in the league right now. And if he can really mentally bring himself up another level, maybe physically he can't, but if mentally he thinks that he can go up another 20%, that will be absolutely incredible to the Boston offense. And so pleasantly surprised, I would say that Brad Marchand's confidence has gone up that much where he can go into the first game and win a shootout, which we normally cannot do.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of guys you could choose for this. Mine, though, is definitely Kevin Miller. After the injuries that he sustained and missed basically 2 seasons, and had multiple knee surgeries. I didn't think he was ever going to play again, honestly. And not only for him to come back and play at the NHL level, but he's played really well to start this season. And it feels like the old Kevin Miller is back and ready to go. And he's physical. He's been smart defensively. He, is very responsible. He's good on the penalty kill. You're never going to get a ton of offense out of him, but he's such a good defensive defenseman, and he's been that to start this season for the Bruins. So I think Kevin Miller has been a very pleasant surprise, and definitely a little bit unexpected given the injuries that he had. I thought there'd be a lot more rust on his game at the beginning of the year, but he's looked really solid so far.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of, like I said, I live in Washington, D.C., so I watch a lot of Washington football team games as well. And it reminds me a lot of Alex Smith coming back
Yep.
and having to take the reins. He wasn't expected to be the starter. Kevin Miller wasn't necessarily expecting when he came back to take over the leadership on the blue line, not realizing that Chara was going to leave right before training camp. So I think it's something that Kevin Miller has really come into his own and really surprised a lot of us, the same way that Alex Smith did in Washington for football. And even though Alex Smith did have a lot of rest, Kevin Miller is really impressing a lot of Bruins fans that were hugely skeptical that he was going to come in. And, he was a supporting defenseman. He wasn't, a star. He wasn't like hugely impressing all of us. He was really, like you said, a modern enforcer, could score, could keep a consistency on the blue line. And that's exactly what the Bruins need right now with all of those young guys. And I think it's just highlighting his ability to really overcome adversity and bring consistency to the Bruins defense, which is huge right now with the roster that they're currently working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So now to kind of look at the opposite end of things, who has been your biggest disappointment of the season so far?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go with Bergeron only because the offense has been so abysmal. And as someone who is really taking on that leadership role, I kind of look to him to see, what's going on. Why are these young guys not able to really mesh with each other? And I think, obviously, we did talk about the line switching and all of that, but everyone said, it's just a natural transition. They all look up to Bergeron to begin with. They understand the chemistry on the ice with him as a leader and all of these things. And I'm just not seeing it right now. And the first line is not, showing that consistency that they were last year. And, it's different without Pastrnak and all of that. But I'm just not seeing the spark that everyone expected with Bergeron to take over this offense and this team. And I know it's only been 3 games and he obviously has not been captain for very long, but it's not wowing me at this point.
Yeah, I something seems to be missing with Patrice Bergeron to start this season. He doesn't have that same jump that we usually see with him, and he's usually a guy that's driving the play up and down the ice. And I mean, obviously, he's so good defensively. I would say he's probably he's the greatest two-way forward that we've seen in this modern era of the NHL. And he just, I don't know, something just seems like it's missing with Bergeron. And I don't know if it's because there's been so much other issues around the team offensively, or if it's because Pastrnak isn't there, or what the deal is, but he just hasn't had that same jump and that same impact on the game that we're used to seeing from Patrice Bergeron. And that's something that really has to get better over the course of this season, because if Bergeron isn't the Patrice Bergeron that we're used to, that's a huge blow to this Boston lineup, and going to be a straight up problem over the course of the season if he doesn't get his game back to where it usually is.
Yeah, I mean, as a defensive, as the defensive player that he is, he keeps the puck in the offensive zone a lot. And if they're not getting a lot of the shots that they need because there's so many turnovers. And so they really need him to step it up in terms of keeping that puck in the zone, getting it back, poking it out when people are taking it away, the entire scope. And he's not necessarily, like you said, there's not the jump there to get that puck back when it's taken away, to jump into the play and make sure that the Bruins are on top of it, that they're maintaining the game's dominance, that they're keeping control, and that they're getting those extra shots off that are going to go in.
Yeah, 100%. My pick for most disappointing has been Jake DeBrusk. I don't know what it is with this kid, but I thought this was going to be a big year for him. You go back a couple years, he had a really big season. He finally, he looked like he was becoming that scorer and that top six winger that he was supposed to be when he was drafted. And he had a really good year playing with Krejci, and it was like, okay, Jake DeBrusk has arrived. And then last year, it wasn't a good season for him. His goal totals went down. He wasn't nearly as impactful as he was the year before. And he was going in, it was a contract year for him, and he needed a new deal this offseason. And I honestly thought he was a guy that Boston should have heavily looked into trading, because with the exception of that 1 year, there's that consistency hasn't been there for DeBrusk. But they re-sign him this offseason. They give him, a pretty decent deal, a bridge deal at they got him under $4 million, which is good. I think, solid cap hit there for what he is. But coming in, still playing with David Krejci, where he's been consistently on the left side of David Krejci through, pretty much his entire NHL career now. And I was expecting him to have a big, big year this year. I thought we were going to see that 25 goal, 30 goal pace, and him really have a bounce back season. And so far, I just looked it up. He has 0 points in the first 3 games. He's -2. He hasn't been impactful. He's moved up now to the top line with Pastrnak out and Studnicka not working out up there. He's now moved to the right side and is up with Bergeron and Marchand. He looked a little bit better in the Islanders game, but he still can't find the score sheet. And I think the Bruins just need a whole lot more out of Jake DeBrusk.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating to see him get a raise and get a nice contract. Like you said, I mean, it's pretty cap friendly for the Bruins, but if he's got 0 points for a guy that's supposed to be a consistent second liner, it's not cap friendly because it's not worth their money.
Yeah.
And they should be trying to shop him, because I'm sure that there is a team that will take him. And, if we throw one of these picks that we keep throwing away on prospects that aren't going to go anywhere, we can probably get a good return in a better elite player that will probably make a more immediate impact.
Yeah, I agree. I'd be shopping DeBrusk at this point. I just haven't seen any sort of consistency from him, and I thought actually Craig Smith coming in would be a help for Jake DeBrusk, because Craig Smith throughout his career has been one of the more consistent players that I've seen, where he's at 20 goals every single season, and he was just a very solid, consistent, middle-of-your-lineup secondary scorer for the Nashville Predators for so long. And I thought maybe some of that could rub off on DeBrusk. But so far, Smith, obviously he was injured to start the year, so he's had a bit of a slow start. Also just trying to get acclimated to a new team, playing with Boston for the first time. And, he hasn't really done anything yet, and DeBrusk doesn't look any better than he was last season. So I'd be thinking, call up the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, Edmonton's a team that's always trying to add secondary scoring, because they need somebody that can play on the wings with McDavid and Draisaitl. Like, they've got that killer 1-2 punch down the middle, but then a revolving door on their wings of guys that just can't live up to playing with those two. I feel like, Edmonton would be a team that would listen for Jake DeBrusk, and maybe you could pull a young, maybe a defenseman back, maybe like a Caleb Jones or an Ethan Bear type. Although I think you'd have to give up more to get Ethan Bear out of Edmonton. But I feel like there's at least a trade discussion to be made there if you're Don Sweeney, and you'd probably could get someone that's going to give you more than what Jake DeBrusk has over the last year plus now.
Yeah, and I think Edmonton is actually a really good option, because we were, again, on our podcast this week, we are going to be discussing what Edmonton should do, because their record is pretty abysmal right now. And, McDavid should be upset, Draisaitl should be upset, but their front office should be shopping anybody that is not those two and trying to figure out how to rebuild that roster and try not to slip into the basement of the North Division. And I think that guys like Jake DeBrusk, who we don't really need right now, are perfect guys to be targeting.
Yeah, and I think DeBrusk is someone, because he's still 24, has value on the trade market, where at this point, if you're trying to move somebody who's, 27, 28, unless they're playing well, they kind of lose that trade value on the market. Teams want younger guys who they think can, still develop and improve and get better for them. Whereas the older guys, you kind of get what you're going to get. And, any of the older guys that Boston could look at trading, I mean, if they're worth anything, Boston probably needs them, because they're producing if they're worth anything on the trade market. So it would have to be a younger guy that got moved if Boston was going to make a move. But from what I've seen from DeBrusk, I just think he's a guy that you could move on from and probably still get something decent back in return for, as opposed to trying to move like a Kasha or a Richie, who at this point, their trade value is completely tanked to the point where no one would probably even want them unless you're almost getting nothing back in return.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And I find it really ironic that you said that all the older guys that the Bruins would shop are actually contributing. Usually it's the opposite problem. When we had David Backes and we were doing everything we could to try to get rid of him, the
Hmm.
Bruins are actually in the opposite problem in a desperation stage where if we lose another veteran guy, we're going to be screwed and just probably enter a rebuild by that point.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, your best players have been Bergeron, Marchand, Coyle, and Krejci, who also happen to be your oldest players. And it's you haven't gotten what you wanted out of those young guys that have been pushed up in the roster and into the lineup, which is unfortunate because I think the Bruins were heavily banking on those young guys taking that next step this year and really moving themselves up into being, proving that they belong in an NHL lineup. And they just it's only been 3 games. I feel like I might be getting a little bit of an overreaction here. It's only been 3 games, but from what we've seen so far, I just been a little bit disappointed in some of those younger guys who haven't really done anything on the score sheet.
yeah.
All right, now looking ahead, final thing I want to talk about, the week ahead for Boston. They have a tough week here. That's why I think most Bruins fans were hoping that they would start the season with at least 2 wins out of those first 3 games, because this next week is not going to be an easy one. So this episode, the first Flyers game will have happened by the time this gets out publicly. But they got 2 against the Flyers, and then they get 2 against the Pittsburgh Penguins. And those are teams that are not going to be easy to beat. The Flyers, with the exception of that really just weird debacle against the Buffalo Sabres,
Yeah.
on what was it, Monday night against Buffalo, where they got absolutely destroyed. They came back, they beat Buffalo the next night on Tuesday. Flyers have looked really good to start the season, with the exception of that one Sabres game. And they're not going to be an easy team to beat for the Boston Bruins, especially a team that can score the way that the Flyers can. Boston's going to have to put up goals if they want to beat Philadelphia.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things about playing the Flyers is that they keep a really consistent pace on the ice. They don't slow
Hmm.
down,
Yep.
and that's really hard for the Bruins because the Bruins slump during games, and once they lose that pace, they're not good at getting it back. It's the reason they lost the Stanley Cup to the Blues, because they
Yep.
lost pace and they could never get it back, and it's a consistent issue that they never address ever. And I
Hmm.
think that against the Flyers, it's part of the reason they struggled in the bubble in that round robin as well, because the Flyers have a really great pace, they have a really great consistency, and they're still riding that high from how well they were doing during the COVID-19 shutdown all the way through the bubble. That obviously they lost to the Islanders, but no one expected them to be that good, and they only improved their roster in the offseason. And I chose them to be, a team that falls short this season. But I don't know that I was right looking at them in these first few games. I think that Sabres loss was probably an anomaly,
Hmm.
and it kills me to say it as a Bruins fan. The Flyers are going to do well, but they look fantastic. Carter Hart is an incredible goalie for his age, and I think that they do have a good 2 goalie situation with Brian Elliott as well. And I am just not looking forward to playing the Flyers. I'm hoping that they can pull out at least 1 win so that they can the Bruins can get that confidence back on the ice. I think if they
Hmm.
do lose these games, it's going to be really hard going into winnable games against the Penguins and trying to get W's there if they've taken 2 more losses.
Yeah, absolutely. If you start the season with only 1 win in your first 4 or 5 games, that really does start to affect the confidence. And then once the confidence gets affected, then you end up maybe losing some games that you shouldn't be losing just because you don't have that winnability factor in your mind. And then that's when things can go really downhill and you start piling losses up. And in a shortened season, you don't have the time to make up for those bad losses, and you can sink your season pretty quickly this year with only 56 games. The Flyers, I was actually very high on the Flyers heading into this year. I picked them to win the division. I also have Carter Hart winning the Vezina Trophy this year. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but
It's a hot take, but it's possible.
preseason predictions are always fun because you never know what's actually going to happen. But I think the Flyers are a tough matchup for Boston because they've got consistent scoring from all four lines, and that's something that the Bruins don't have. And I just feel like the Flyers are a team that can outscore Boston unless the Bruins play that lockdown defense that they've shown that they can play early in this season. They got to play like they did against the Islanders defensively, though. They really got to try and shut down that offense for Philadelphia because the Flyers are a team that can score goals in bunches, and Boston I don't think has the offense to counter that to where they're not going to win a 5-4 game. They need these games to be 3-2 or 2-1, not 5-4, because it's going to be difficult for the Bruins to win those high-scoring games.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point going into both the Flyers and the Penguins games is that all of the Penguins games this season have been incredibly high scoring.
Yep.
Both because the Penguins goalies are not doing fantastic right now, but the Penguins offense is absolutely incredible.
Yep.
So I think that's something really important to note going into those games. But two of the games the Penguins play were against the Flyers. So, both of these offenses are really aggressive. And I think we do have something that we can probably work with going against Jarry and DeSmith in Pittsburgh. But that's assuming that they still slump in two games. The Penguins might have gotten their goalie situation together by then. DeSmith did not play badly against the Capitals. It was just a really high-scoring game. Jarry played awful. We don't know who they're going to start. So, it's a toss-up. And, again, going after the Flyers, we might not even be in a state to beat Jarry. Who's to say?
Yeah, for sure. And one good thing going in the Bruins' favor is the Flyers are dealing with some pretty serious injury issues right now. Sean Couturier out. He's their top line center. They were able to kind of deal with the loss of Couturier, but now after the other night, Morgan Frost separated his shoulder. So he's out. He's on IR now. So that was Couturier's replacement in the lineup. Now he's injured as well. And they lost Phil Myers off of the back end with I believe a rib injury. And he's week to week. So they're not going to have either of those guys for the series this coming Thursday and Saturday against Boston. So I feel like if you're the Bruins, you got to kind of take advantage of that. The Flyers are down some guys, some important players as well, especially with Couturier and Myers off the decor. You got to take advantage of that if you're Boston and try and find a way to win, if at least one, if not both of these games.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, if they lose both of them, I think we're going to be in a really bad place. I think it'll really, especially with only a 56 game season, it's going to be really hard. And in the toughest division, realignment for COVID-19 this year, it's going to be really hard for us to reclimb that, ladder up into the top four because the Capitals have a good record. The Penguins are in last place right now, and they have a win, which is just crazy to me. The division itself is so competitive, and the Devils weren't supposed to be this good. The Sabres weren't supposed to be this good. And now the Bruins were not supposed to be this bad. So, it's really hard for us to be slumping right now. And it's really difficult as a fan seeing how great the Penguins and the Flyers are playing. Not that the Penguins are playing fantastic, but, even as a middle ground team, it's tough for us to go into playing a middle ground team when there's so many question marks up for us.
Yeah, I was really the Pittsburgh Penguins were one of the teams I was really expecting a big decline from this season. I thought we were going to start to see that. I mean, that defense there is just so bad, and their goaltending isn't great. Although DeSmith played pretty well against Washington. I mean, he did all he could, but with that defense in front of him, the Bruins should be able to beat the Pittsburgh Penguins. I look at their rosters. I look at where these teams are at. The Boston Bruins should be a better team than the Pittsburgh Penguins. But the fact that they've started the season so down from where I expected Boston to be, it's got me a little worried heading into those Penguin games as well, especially since the Penguins have shown they can score a ton of goals. The offense is still there. They can score a ton. Their defense is pretty bad, but if they make it a 6-5 game, the Penguins are probably going to win that. So I'm a little worried heading into that Penguins series as well.
None of those games are back-to-backs, correct? Or are we
No, there's
facing?
yeah, they're spaced with one day in between.
Okay, that's helpful. I know that a couple teams are facing their first back-to-backs this week, which
Hmm.
is, going to be a challenge as well. So I'm glad the Bruins don't have to face that yet.
Yes, for sure. But man, Pittsburgh, they've been better than I thought they were going to be, and that offense just hasn't missed a beat. Now I do feel like Pittsburgh's one injury away from just completely collapsing.
It's
Like
usually
if
how it goes in
yeah,
Pittsburgh.
yeah, if they lose one of their big guns up front, all of a sudden the offense goes away and that defense is just not going to be able to hold up. But so far everyone's been healthy for the Penguins. So that's not going to be an easy matchup for the Bruins either. And man, they have a huge week this week. I feel like they've got to win at least 2 out of these next 4 games. They have to win at least 2. If they go 1-3 or 0-4, I mean, you're digging yourself in a hole that's going to be very difficult to climb out of in a shortened season.
Yeah, I completely agree. And in a dream world, the Capitals would, slump a little bit this week as well. I think that they do have a little bit of a benefit now that Samsonov, Ovechkin, and Kucherov, I believe,
Orlov and
are
Kuznetsov,
Kuznetsov,
the
not
four
Kucherov.
Russians, yeah, they
Yeah,
were all hanging out together.
yeah, they all are in COVID-19 protocol because they were partying in a hotel room. So,
Yep.
that's good for the Bruins because they are going to be missing some key guys going into this next week.
Hmm.
But that's assuming that the Capitals lose. That's assuming the Bruins win. So, there's a ton up in the air this week. It's going to be really interesting.
All right, for sure. Definitely a big week coming up for the Bruins, but we have hit the 1 hour mark. We've actually gone a little over, which is great. Always good to get a lot of talk in and as many topics as possible. But Shannon, really, really appreciate you coming on, taking the time to do this, and it was great talking Boston Bruins hockey with you.
Yeah, this was really fun. I'm happy to come on again and make sure you come on to Slapshot Sweethearts as well so we can talk a little bit more Bruins as well.
Awesome. That would be great for sure. And we'd certainly love to have you on again in the future here. That is episode 4, folks, of Black and Gold Weekly. Our guest here was Shannon from the Slapshot Sweethearts podcast, a fantastic hockey podcast that you all absolutely need to check out. It's so much fun to listen to. And I'm always there checking it out each and every week. So that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys all so much. Huge thank you to our guest today, Shannon. And we'll talk to you next week here for episode 5. We'll have another big week of Bruins action to cover, and we'll see how they do this coming week against some very tough opponents in the Philadelphia Flyers and Pittsburgh Penguins. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.